Andrew Leigh, Andrew Laming, good morning, welcome.
Morning, Chris. Morning, Andrew.
Morning. Hi, Andrew.
Now, Andrew Leigh, to you first. Is Labor's policy on asylum seekers arriving by boat now essentially identical to that of the government's, or are there still significant differences?
Significant differences, Chris. Labor's conference over the weekend resolved that a Labor government would double the number of refugees Australia takes, in contrast to the coalition's having cut the refugee intake as one of their first acts on winning office. We've said we'd make a significant contribution to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees to make sure that their important work of getting refugees out of camps can be better done. We've said that we want to see more transparency around Australia's offshore facilities and around the use of our naval assets. We had a significant debate over turnbacks, as you should expect for a Labor conference. Labor conferences almost invariably have serious policy debates. And there were reasonable differences on that because no one, frankly, wants to see boats being turned back. But in the end, we did resolve that this should remain an option for a future Labor government.
So no one wants to see boats turned back, but it's now Labor policy?
Well, it's the act of turning a boat back is an act of last resort. Our policy of a refugee resettlement agreement has done most of the work in preventing boats coming to Australia, but as Bill Shorten and Richard Marles said, the boat turnbacks policy has clearly played a role, and that option remains available to a future Shorten government.
So the government has depicted Labor on asylum seekers as being too soft. Would it be a fair kind of characterisation, to paraphrase Labor's policy, is now saying it's just as tough as the government's but more humane?
I think it's wrong to think about soft and hard in this debate, Chris. I'm focused on Australia taking more refugees, on us never again having people drowning at sea trying to get here, and treating people decently in our asylum seeker facilities and getting kids out of detention. All of those goals are shared right across the party, and over the weekend I was the official conference spokesperson, and it was a real honour to play that role at a conference where you had serious disagreement over important issues but a bedrock of respect from both sides.
Okay, Andrew Laming, do you believe that the Labor conference has now neutralised asylum seekers as an election issue?
Well, I certainly welcome the change, Chris. Of all of those resolutions on the weekend, I thought they were going to say that they were going to contemplate boat turnbacks by 2030. Interesting, it's the one resolution that actually is reasonably immediate, which does show the political survival for Labor that is wrapped around this issue. Boat turnbacks is exactly what has stemmed the flow, nothing more powerful than seeing a boat being basically turned around and sent back to where it originated the journey from to stop new people from wasting their money in this dangerous enterprise. So I think Andrew's been very magnanimous, and it's good to see Labor, in this case, reversing a dreadful management of this area since 2008 when Kevin Rudd unpicked all of the laws that were working just fine.
So this does neutralise it as an election issue then. If Labor's just as tough, it accepts the need, when it's safe to do so, to turn back boats, offshore processing, asylum seekers coming to Australia by boat will not be resettled here. It neutralises the issue.
Well, I just hope we neutralise the problem itself, not necessarily trying to trawl politics out of this. If we can fix the problem, then mission accomplished, and obviously history will record the excruciating pain that we had to go through for 6 years to arrest that flow, to treat people humanely, to avoid the drownings, to get kids out of detention, and then start to replace these arrivals with genuine UN-identified refugees, and that is the 100% process that occurs in the rest of the world where we should be devoting our energy. And once we stop this irregular arrival, then of course we can increase our intake if we choose to.
And so what do you think of Labor's proposal to increase the intake of those, what you're depicting as regular arrivals?
Well, I mean, it's a wonderful approach if you can first of all stop the irregular arrivals, and it's a little cheap by half for the party that unpicked the solutions in the first place and created the problem, to at the same time to be talking about increasing arrivals, increasing processing. So once you do get it under control, then it's the luxury you are afforded to talk about increasing refugee intake. No problem with having that discussion now.
Chris, I can't let Andrew's comments go without making absolutely clear that more than half of the people who drowned during Labor's term in government did so after the Liberals and the Greens together voted down the Malaysia Agreement, an agreement which would have played a significant role in stopping deaths at sea.
I thought Labor's didn't want to talk about the past, it wanted to talk about the future on this issue.
It's absolutely important to recognise that Labor's been focused on trying to get compassionate solutions that reduce drownings at sea, but see us take more refugees.
You say there's still significant differences between the parties on this issue, so that leaves the way open, does it not, for Tony Abbott and his ministers to campaign heavily on those differences?
If Tony Abbott wants to run a campaign against Labor, saying that Australia ought to remain stingy in the number of refugees it takes, that cutting the refugee intake was the morally right thing to do.
Stay stingy. Is Australia stingy on the amount of refugees it takes?
Look, I believe it was a stingy decision by the Abbott government to cut the refugee intake from 20,000 to 13,000 upon winning office. That's come at the same time as they've essentially halved our level of foreign aid as a share of national income. We're a significant player on the world stage, Chris. A country that sits in the top 15 in GDP rank, a country whose economic position, although I'm concerned about things like the rise in unemployment, does remain better than many advanced countries. So we can afford to do these
Andrew
things.
Leigh, what do you think of that depiction of the government as stingy on these humanitarian issues?
Well, that was the level that Labor had prior to the coalition as well. We simply reverted it back from 20 back to 12 where it was, and that at that level was second in the world for per capita UN refugee intake after Canada. So I agree 20 is higher than 12, but there's nothing wrong with 12.
OK, let's move on then. Tax reform is in the air and debating different options. Andrew Leigh, what do you think about this proposal for a so-called Warren Buffett tax? In other words, high-income earners, I think the figures being bandied around is those earning over $300,000 a year, would need to pay a minimum amount of income tax.
Well, the best way to demonstrate one's moral supremacy is to dream up a way to take more tax off wealthy people. And it often drifts into this kind of debate at Labor conferences. But in reality, if there's a problem that one has with the tax system and the deductions that are available to Australians, then Labor should be talking about those deductions and reforming them. Now, of course, someone earning $1 million and paying no tax is a head-scratcher. But let's actually look at that case, de-identify it, and work out what actually happened in that year that they had that level of deductions. If we want to change the rules, we change them for everyone. But if we mistrust our tax system so much that we say we don't think the system should apply to wealthy people, then I think we are cheapening this debate. It's tempting, but let's be realistic. If they've got those legitimate deductions and the ATO's investigated them and confirmed that, then I ask you, what is the problem?
Andrew Leigh.
Chris, the debate over the so-called Buffett rule goes, as Andrew's correctly said, to the question of deductions. The government's own tax white paper asks questions about the fairness and sustainability of negative gearing. That's an issue that's been raised by the Reserve Bank recently. The Reserve Bank doesn't normally comment on matters of public policy, but it has raised concern about the impact that negative gearing is having on the property market. We've got KPMG today coming out saying that negative gearing ought to be looked at. And rather than playing small target politics and ruling out considering any of these issues, Labor's said we're happy to have a sensible conversation around housing affordability and negative gearing, with the provisos that existing investors wouldn't be affected, and that we'd want to make sure that we improved housing affordability.
Andrew Leigh, you describe these sort of deductions as legitimate, and that's certainly the case. They're all legal. There's no suggestion here that people are evading tax. But there's a whole series that if you're not weighed down by paying off a mortgage, you have opportunities for negative gearing, you have superannuation vehicles, you have dividend imputations, you have discounts on capital gains. There's a whole series of measures there that people can quite legitimately access. And the overall impact of those is people with high disposable incomes can minimise their tax. Does that not need to be revisited? And isn't the Buffett tax a simple way of addressing a complex issue?
Look, it's a simple way of making just a whole set of new problems. Look, Andrew very eloquently talked about negative gearing. I'm just not sure that that's the reason why these high-income earners have paid very little tax. It's way more likely they've structured their affairs accordingly with some elaborate, tax minimisation vehicles, possibly disposed of an asset that year. I'm blind on this. I'd like to see the actual cases of how people are evading tax to see if it's actually illegal or not. I'm sure they're following the law. I mean, honestly,
so if you are blind on this, how can you so simply rule out something like the buffer tax?
I don't know why Mr and Mrs B paid a low level of tax. We need to look at the case specifically. I don't think it's negative gearing at all. I appreciate Andrew's raised that one issue, but I doubt that's the reason that high-income earners are paying no tax. With the greatest of respect, there'll be a whole lot of other reasons why they don't. And in the end, if there's a problem with the system, let's debate the system. But I think picking on wealthy people is something that happens around Labor conference, and we need to move on from it.
Andrew Leigh, I mean, the taxation system has evolved over many decades. It's very complicated. Doesn't Andrew Leigh have a good point there that a buffer tax or something is kind of a band-aid covering up the impact of a whole series of different incentives and disincentives that have been built into the income tax system in particular over the years?
Well, I think Andrew was completely right at the end there when he said, let's debate the system. That was the approach that the government's tax white paper took. But sadly, it hasn't been the approach that the Prime Minister and the Treasurer have taken. Every time a significant conversation comes up, whether it's around high-end superannuation, multinational taxation, negative gearing, they shut it down. They say no changes, not now, not ever. That doesn't depict the sort of demonstrate the sort of maturity that was inherent in Andrew's contribution there, where he's saying let's have an evidence-based discussion. Negative gearing is the largest deduction, and it's reasonable for Australians to want to have a conversation about how it impacts on housing affordability.
Okay, this is a very complex area, so let me just try and boil it down to the most simple terms. Put the same question to both of you. Andrew Leigh first. Do you believe very wealthy Australians, high-income earners, the top 1 or 2%, are paying their fair share of tax?
I certainly think they're paying a considerable amount of tax. That share has gone up in part because the income inequality has risen, because the top 1% have a larger share of total income. But as an economist, I'm fundamentally a tax reformer. I'm always interested in how we can make the system work better. We'll have those mature and sensible discussions within the Labor Party over the course of the next year. We won't play these sort of silly rule-out games the government likes to engage in.
But do you believe that as a group that really high-income earning group is paying a fair share of tax?
Well, I think we need to look at the particular deductions rather than total contribution. We need to make sure that rules are fair, and looking at those at the fairness of particular rules is, I think, more useful than looking at aggregate measures in this instance.
Andrew Leigh, what's your feeling? Are those really high income earners? Are they paying a fair share of tax?
Yes, they are. Simple answer. So I can just elaborate on that by saying that Andrew is the one person on the Labor Party who can meaningfully look at the array of complex deductions and decide from a Labor point of view which ones they want to put forward at the next election as policy change. He's already done that for international tax evasion and should do the same in this area of deductions. Nothing is stopping the Labor Party from doing that, bringing those ideas forward. You've seen a brief mention there of changing arrangements for negative gearing. Well, let the people decide. Andrew, put something forward and let's have it ready for the next election. We've committed no change between now and the next election.
So Andrew Leigh, if those really high income earners are paying their fair share of tax, then it cannot be used as an argument to increase the GST to 15%. There are other arguments, but it has been one that's been advanced, that an increase in GST rate would capture more tax from the very high income earners.
Well, my piece in The Australian last week ferociously negated the case and said that we should leave GST precisely where it is and work on more efficient social sector service delivery. There is a place for increasing a tax if you are purchasing something new with it, like an NDIS. I would support a change to the Medicare levy. That will be one way to make sure the NDIS became a reality.
What sort of change to the Medicare levy?
Well, it's already been increased by Julia Gillard with general community support. And if we still find the NDIS is short on funds, that's one way to make sure it happens. Let's not touch the GST. You'll simply shovel more money into social service delivery that is inefficient at the moment. We can do much better. Australia has the fastest growing health expenditure in the world with the least restraint after the Eastern Bloc, Turkey and Chile.
Andrew Leigh, what do you think about increasing the Medicare levy?
It's certainly not something that Labor's put forward, and it does seem to sit at odds with Andrew's suggestion that the top are already paying their fair share of tax.
Okay, gentlemen, let's leave it there for today.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks, Andrew.